So let's talk property ownership. And this is going to be 8 test questions on the exam. So we know that the number one thing that we're going to study is contracts. We'll get there later this week. Number 2 is going to be agency. Number 3 is going to be practice of real estate. And then your 4th category is either going to be this or finance in terms of order and the biggest impact on the exam. So I'm going to put this in place 4 or 5 because it's got 8 test questions. I think primarily we need to know the definition of land. And that is not just the Earth's surface, but it's air rights up into the sky and it's subsurface rights down into the core of the Earth. I do think that there's a good chance you're going to have a question about water rights. And there's 3 kind of different levels here. There's riparian rights and littoral rights. Riparian, how I remember that is rivers or smaller. Littoral rights I remember as lakes or larger. What I think you need to know about riparian rights is if you and I are neighbors and we've got a little stream of water between us, our property line most likely is going to be in the center of that water source. Now, we can float all over the water. There's no way to really keep me from floating on your side. But what we can't do is fish from your side or build a dock from your side and vice versa. I cannot do that. The other type of riparian right is, think of something that's government controlled, like the mighty Mississippi or the Missouri River. Those are government controlled water sources, and no one's going to own to the center of that. You're just going to own to the banks of that river. The other thing that might come up with littoral rights is that beachfront property. Where is your property line? And remember, when you go to the beach, there's dry sand, wet sand, and then the water. That wet sand represents high tide or the high water mark. And that's traditionally where your property line is going to be. Now, you and I know that a lot of these beaches that you go to visit, a section of that is government controlled so that the public can use it. Otherwise, as a basic kind of concepts, high tide is where your water line is or where your property line is. Where I really think you're going to get hit on the exam if you got anything about water rights is going to be the doctrine of prior appropriation. And that states that we've got to have permission from the government in order to irrigate our crops. So in places where water sources are dry, not Iowa, think of a very dry state. To irrigate their crops, they would need permission from the government to do so. Doctrine of prior appropriation. And I get it. That description has nothing to do with the term, right? Those things don't really feel like they connect. But that's definitely where my mind would go for you on the exam, is for them to test around that. The other element that I think you really need to dive into is knowing the difference between personal property and a fixture. So everything is personal property in the beginning. Your bank accounts, you have 2x4s delivered to a bare lot. You've got shingles that get delivered and they're sitting in the driveway. All of those things start as personal property. But when they become permanently attached to the property and built into a structure, such as a home or a building, now they become permanent real estate and they stay with the land. This also includes other permanent fixtures, such as heating and cooling, plumbing, cabinetry, outlets, fixtures. Did I say cabinets? Carpet, flooring. Those are not only installed in a permanent fashion, but with the intent to stay. Okay. Now, a couple of other things I want to point out about personal property. Motorhomes and mobile homes are on wheels, correct? So they are personal property. They are not permanent to the land. So if that pops up, don't get fooled by it, because those are personal property. They're not permanent. Here's my general rule for fixtures. And I know that I've kind of joked on PSI asking you some psycho level questions, Psychological Services Incorporated. But for this purpose, for the exam, if you turn the house upside down and it would fall, it's personal property. That's going to be my general rule to help you navigate through the exam. Then we went on another level of plants, and we learned the difference between an annual and a perennial. So an annual is going to be something that you got to replant every year, and it's personal property. Another word that we used for that was chattel. That's a legal term for personal property. Your other option is a perennial, and a perennial regrows itself every year, even if you've tried to get rid of it. I've found in my yard, it's regrown itself even when I haven't wanted it to. But that's going to be things like grass, trees, bushes, shrubs. Hostas are a big one to me. Hostas regrow themselves every year, right? And one time I sold a property and I had a little old lady. I went over to have her sign closing documents. This little old lady was digging up her hostas. I said, whoa, whoa, whoa. What are you doing? She said, oh, I love these hostas. And I said, I love them too. And I think the buyer loves them. You know, we've got a little bit of a misunderstanding here. Those stay because they regrow themselves. So we got an alternative plan figured out for her. And she hadn't done too much digging up, but that is something that regrows itself, so it stays. If she wanted to keep those, we should have reserved those in a contract. The next layer of this is a trade fixture. And when it comes to a trade fixture, this is not residential. If you've got an exam question that's talking about a trade fixture in someone's residential property, that's a red flag. Those two things don't go together. A trade fixture is for a commercial lease. And a trade fixture also by definition is personal property. We're installing it only for the purpose of doing business. Now, the example that I gave you yesterday, when you go to get your hair cut and they put you up in that magic chair and they hydro lift you up so that your beauty operator doesn't get carpal tunnel, right? We want that anchored to the floor so you don't fall over. Are we all in agreement with that? Yes. That's an example of a trade fixture. But when that salon owner is done with that lease, we're going to take those out and she's going to move those, she's going to move those to wherever they go next for a location. So a trade fixture is a commercial lease and it's permanent installation just for doing business. It's then going to be removed and go with them. Okay, so a trade fixture, commercial, personal property. Then we reviewed types of estates with like a fee simple and a life estate. Those are not priority to me on the exam, but I've got them for you as a resource. If you want an easy way to just memorize this in case it does come up, a fee simple estate indicates you have complete authority to will it, sell it, or gift it to another individual. Anything else means there's a condition to it that doesn't allow you to do that. Then for your career, we talked about homestead and dower rights. Homestead, by definition on the exam, is going to mean that the personal property that you live in, your family home, might be another way that they say it, is protected against most creditors. So if you default on your car loan, they can't take your $300,000 house to make up for that $50,000 car loan. Now, the reason it says most creditors is because obviously if you get a mortgage from a bank, a loan from a bank to buy that property, and you quit paying that back, your house was the collateral to get that loan, and they will do foreclosure proceedings on you. And we'll talk a lot more about foreclosure here coming up later today. That's going to be the definition on the exam. But for your career in Iowa, remember, we've got a homestead credit that you get a little bit of a tax break on your property taxes for living in a home that you own. So always make sure you remind your buyers to go and file with that homestead credit with the county. They've only got to do it once, but do make sure that you remind them, because I sometimes find people are just too overwhelmed when they're moving. And that's a great reason to follow up and keep in touch with your folks, so that they don't forget that little. It's a little savings, but it's worth it. The other thing for your career, though, I do want to just make sure I hit is that dower right. Dower rights in Iowa, the easiest way of saying it is one to buy, two to sell in a marriage, which means if you own something as a single person and you get married, just by marriage, your spouse has dower rights to your real estate property. So you can't sell it now without them. Okay. Here's where I think we jump back into some good test questions. And this is, I'm calling it types of ownership. And that is whether you own it as a single person or it's a co-ownership of two or more, married or unmarried. So single ownership, one person, unmarried, is going to be ownership in severalty. Now, I know it says several in there, and that can be confusing, but I want you to remember it as sever. You're severed off from everyone else. You own that property on your own, again, unmarried. Where we go to co-ownership of two or more, married or unmarried, is going to be joint tenancy or joint tenants. And this, if you're going to get an exam question, I think this is the most popular. And it should be the most popular because it's probably the most widely used. But joint tenancy means that when one owner dies, there is a distinguishing feature of right of survivorship. Right of survivorship means there's simply one less owner. So if you and I own a property together and I pass away, you now own it in severalty. It's automatic. Another way that they might say this is a way for a widowing spouse to avoid probate would be ownership as a joint tenant. Okay, that avoids probate. And then, just as a reminder, probate is that judicial process that someone goes through when they're deceased to validate their estate, whether they've got a will or not. They go through this judicial process of basically inventorying personal and real property. If they do have a will, validating that it was created when they're of sound mind and that it's the most recent version. And then they'll also do a period where they do public announcements and call for any debtors or anyone that would have claims to that estate, to come forward. So if MasterCard has an outstanding bill when I pass away, they're going to see these public announcements and be able to step forward and say, hey, Amy Schaefer's estate owes me money. I had a good friend of mine that when her dad passed away and they made public announcement, he had a daughter that they didn't know step forward, and DNA analysis proved that she was legitimately an heir to his estate. How Maury Povich is that, right? So that's the idea of probate, and we get to skip all of that when it's joint tenants or joint tenancy. Okay. The other option is tenants in common, or tenancy in common might be another way of phrasing it. And this is when we have um, shares of the property. So if you and I own a property with tenants in common, we each own 50%, married or unmarried. We each own 50%. And when one of us passes away, we've got to determine who inherits now my 50%. So we've got to go through probate to determine that. Then trusts might be something that pops up. And a trust is kind of like creating a separate entity where you can house your personal and real property. And there's a trustee that can manage it on behalf of a third party known as a beneficiary. This is where we were joking yesterday and talking about trust fund babies, right? We put money in a trust so they don't blow it all at once. And someone manages that money for them and maybe gives them an allowance, right? Trusts are very common in Iowa. Um, so I definitely think that there's a lot of people that have done that as part of their estate planning. If anyone ever asks you about a trust, that is a legal discussion and you're not an attorney. So you can share with them what you know, but make sure they know to go and get legal counsel for that. Okay. Then the other big rock for this is going to be knowing the difference between a condominium, a cooperative, and a timeshare. I feel like these three things run together on the exam really well as kind of ABC options. A condominium, you are going to have traditional ownership. You're going to own your unit walls in, and then you're going to have shared spaces, the roof line, hallways, elevators, parking spaces, green spaces, maybe a pool, maybe a gym, maybe a community center. So you own your unit in plus all of these common spaces. A cooperative is very, very similar. The difference with that one, though, is it's what they call a proprietary lease. You've got a proprietary lease instead of owning title to it. And then a timeshare is when you own a property for just a specific period of time. Week 31 every year, you get to go to your condo in Vegas, but it's just for that set period of time. Then some other big rocks to tackle is about encumbrances. And I've got three things about encumbrances that I want you to know. Number one, I want you to know the definition that an encumbrance is an interest in real estate that does not rise the level of possession or ownership. Check. Number two, I want you to know that it is specific to the property, not to you as a person, but it is specific to the property. Check. The third thing I want you to know is that it runs with the land, meaning it stays with the property and goes on and on and on until it's resolved and or removed. Check. So the first thing that we tackled as an example of an encumbrance is an easement. And an easement is the right to use someone else's property for a specific purpose, but again, it does not rise the level of ownership or possession. Maybe my neighbor allows me to use their driveway to access my field so that I can farm. That was an example that we used yesterday. So there's going to be an easement on both of our ownership, we'll call that a title, that says, I allow this neighbor to use this much of my driveway to access their field. And then they're going to have something in their title that says, you get to access this much of their driveway to access your own field. And every time the property is bought and sold, that is included in the conditions of what you're buying and selling. We don't need to go to that farmer every time and renegotiate the use of our driveway. The only ways that really a termination is going to happen of an easement is going to be one neighbor buys out the other. And now it's pointless, right? You own both. Or the number two reason is going to be abandonment. And I'm going to say that's going to be a minimum of 20 years if they haven't used it. The other big one I want to hit here is a deed restriction. And a deed restriction, there's kind of two major ways that it could happen. Number one, you've got a homeowners association like a condominium, and you've got HOA bylaws and covenants that dictate how the property is used, how you create a forum to vote on, different topics. Again, how many dogs and cats you can have, right? It's an HOA. But where those HOAs start is with a developer, whether it's going to be single family homes or it's going to be condos. A developer is usually the one that instigates all of these plans of deed restrictions. And it's all going to be about how it's used and how it's built. Then once the developer sells off a majority of the lots, then a homeowners association or an HOA is going to take over and govern that. Okay, or they might hire a third party like a property manager to help them govern it. But it starts with a developer. And then again, once there's a majority of homeowners, again, whether it's condos or single family, they'll take it over and manage it from there. Okay, but it's all about style, how you build it, what it looks like, and how you use it. Where I think they're going to challenge you is to know the difference between a deed restriction and a building code. A building code is managed by your local government, your city. And they're all about safety and sanitation. Okay, so as long as it's safe, that's what they care about. But your HOA is going to care maybe that you don't paint your house seafoam green. Or what was the example I was using? Retina burning orange, I think is the other example I was using. Goldenrod, right? They're going to say no maybe to that, where that's maybe not going to be a building code that the city enforces. They care about safety. Again, the HOA is going to care about style and usage, such as the dog example. Okay, so if someone is building a retina burning orange house, who do you call? Well, you don't call the city, you talk to the HOA, and the HOA could sue that homeowner for damages. So I would know the difference between those two. Then the other major rock with encumbrances is liens, liens. And this, by definition, is a charge against the property to secure repaying a debt. Okay. The number one most common lien I see in real estate is a mortgage lien. A mortgage is a type of loan that we use specifically to buy real estate. And we're using the house as collateral to do it. And by the way, 85% of homeowners get a loan to purchase. Only about 15% pay cash. Now, if you are in farmland or investment properties and commercial, that world's going to change for you. But statistically, residential properties, about 85% of the time, somebody's going to get a loan to buy it. That's how the world works. And what the bank is going to do is they're going to put public notice with the recorder. They're going to put a lien on your property. And then that lets the world know that they have interest in that property. And if you default on that loan, there's going to be consequences. And that they've got the priority of interest in your property. It does not mean that if you've got a mortgage with Wells Fargo, that the president can come stay in your guest bedroom if they're in town for the Principal Charity Classic. No. No. It's just letting the world know that you owe them money. Another very common type of lien is a mechanic's lien. Let's say you have work done to your property. You have a bunch of landscaping done and a new deck put on the back, and then you decide not to pay the vendor. You would be subject to them putting a mechanic's lien on your property, and that's a way for them to control and get paid back, because now it's going to be really hard for you to sell that property without paying them back, right? We want that paid back. Nobody's going to want to buy that debt for you. So that's their security to get paid back. Now, here's the challenging thing I think about liens is there's specific and there's general liens. Specific liens, those are encumbrances. General liens are not encumbrances, but they can affect the title. And the number one type of a general lien is going to be a judgment. And a judgment happens anytime you go to court and a judge says you owe someone money. That could happen in a divorce decree. If a judge says you owe Amy $10,000 because you ran up the credit cards right before you filed. That's a true story. I've seen that one happen. Or maybe there was another type of lawsuit, right? The number one type of judgment I see in residential real estate is child support, right? We went before a judge or family court and they said, Amy, you owe baby daddy X number of dollars a month in child support. That is a general lien. It is a judgment. Now, if you get a question that says, which of the following does not rise to the level of an encumbrance, what they're asking you to do is pick a general lien. General means it follows you wherever you go. It's not specific to the property. So a general lien would be a judgment. Okay. So that would be another really good highlight. Then the last little part of this is descriptions of land, and this is legal descriptions. Remember, what we're really buying and selling here is the legal description created by a survey. We're not just buying the address of 123 Main Street. We're buying the legal description. There are three types of surveys. There is meets and bounds, government rectangular survey system, and lot and block. Meets and bounds, I want you to think original 13 colonies. I want you to think it uses a monument or a point of beginning to start the description. And it literally details all the perimeter of the property all the way back to the beginning. Another example that I gave of you yesterday was if we go 85 feet west, 100 feet south, 85 feet east, how do we get back to the point of beginning? And we all agreed that we would go 100 feet north, correct? To connect that survey. Then the rectangular government survey system is where we started to get in order. And we created this generic term called a township line. Every 6 miles going north and south, every 6 miles going east and west. Now, specifically, the lines that go east and west are called tiers. Remember, I had you take that capital T and make it into an arrow? That's east and west. That's a tier. Specifically, the township lines that go north and south is a range line. Remember, I had you create that capital R as an arrow. That's a range line north and south. Where those lines intersect, we are making a 6 mile by 6 mile square known as a township. And within that township are 36 1 mile by 1 mile or 1 square mile sections. Now let's dive even deeper. Where I really think if you're going to be challenged, you need to know how many square feet are in 1 acre. And that is 43,560. Okay. You very well could have a question that challenges you to convert square footage into acres. And what you're going to do is you're going to take that square footage and divide by 43,560 to produce the number of acres. And then last but not least was that lot and block. And lot and block is going to be a recorded plat map. It's going to fit within this government rectangular survey, but it's going to be a recorded plat map is what I want you to know for that one. Now, of this section for 8 test questions, here's what's high on my mind. Absolutely knowing the difference in water rights, specifically doctrine of prior appropriation. The next thing that I think is very mindful is knowing the difference between personal property and a fixture. That's going to include knowing the difference between a perennial and an annual. The third thing that is very high on my mind is knowing a trade fixture. Again, that's personal property for the course of doing business in a commercial lease. The fourth thing that is really high on my list is knowing that ownership type of severalty and joint tenancy. And you could have maybe 1 or 2 questions on that. Okay. Now, by the way, if you get a question about the same thing more than once, don't freak out. This is not an exam that's keeping track of what you've input for answers, and so they start asking you other questions around it to trip you up. They do not calculate your score until you say you're done. So if you do get something that's repetitive, don't freak out. Hopefully, maybe that even helps you answer it, but you just have gotten lucky and you got repetition. That's all that means. But over that type of ownership, around severalty or joint tenancy, in that category, I think you could have 1 or 2 questions. Now we're at about 5 of the 8. I do think that knowing a cooperative condo and town or timeshare would maybe be number 6 on my list. Knowing, I think you'll have a couple things on encumbrances, and you're going to have 2 of these 3. I think it's going to really dive into either an easement, a deed restriction, or a lien. I've got you to about 8 now. And I do think you have a question around something in legal descriptions. But those are kind of my highlights, if that helps you. I've probably given you about 10 instead of 8 test questions there. But that should be your high points that I hope they test you on, because it's good for you to know for your Then we got into land use controls. You got 4 test questions there. And this is going to be over police power, eminent domain, taxation, and a sheet. 4 test questions. Where I think that you're going to need to know content here is that non-conforming use and variance. And I think you could have maybe more. I think you could have 2 of the 4 just on those. Non-conforming use means that if building codes change, you are grandfathered in. You don't need to update your property every time there's a building code change. You're grandfathered in. However, if the property is destroyed, now you got to build it to code. If for some reason you cannot build it to current code, the only way around it is for you to get a variance from the city, which means they're giving you an exception to the rule. And they usually are willing to give exceptions if you can prove that there's some sort of hardship that's been created. The example that I gave to you was someone that I knew that had a storefront, and the highway was widened, took away a bunch of their frontage. Their property burned down, and then to rebuild it, they were going to have a sliver of a property if they did the current setback. And so that city gave them a variance and let them rebuild it exactly where it was previous to the destruction. They had to get permission to do it. You got 1 or 2 in that. Eminent domain is very likely to me. And eminent domain means that the government has the right to acquire private property for public use. It's got to be for public use. It cannot be for a parochial or private school. It cannot be for your personal investment portfolio. It's got to be for public use. And then under taxation, I'm sure you're familiar with property taxes, right? That's a tax that we pay to help fund our local government entities, such as our police officers and our teachers. Where I do think you've got a great candidate for a test question is going to be over a special assessment. This is a tax above and beyond property taxes. It's for a special project that you as the property owner benefited from. So the 2 examples I gave you yesterday, I had a listing one time that was on private sewer with about 8 to 10 other neighbors. When that sewer system failed, the city of Des Moines forced them to go on public sewer. And each of those 8 to 10 houses in that block had to pay a special assessment to go onto that city sewer. Not everyone paid for that, just those 8 to 10 homeowners that benefited. Right? Another example I gave you is Windsor Heights when they put in sidewalks. My understanding of that is the city paid for the sidewalks. But if you had to have a retaining wall or any landscaping built, they did that work and then they charged you a special assessment for it because you're the one that benefited from that landscaping. So it's a tax above and beyond. And then I know we talked about capital gains and how to defer that by putting a property in a 1031 tax exchange. That might be a question. I think that's pretty low on my list. A sheet I know we talked about is when someone dies with no family, no will, that the state of Iowa inherits their property. Oh, sheet. I didn't have a plan and no family. Iowa gets my stuff. Or they cheat might be another more PG way of remembering that. My high priority for you out of this section is non-conforming use versus variance, eminent domain, and special assessments. And I hope you get tested on those things because those are also things that you're going to use in your career quite often.